Hi, everyone. Welcome to True You Podcast, a storytelling space for self discovery, where we use this safe and brave space to address racial trauma and healing for Black women through our own lived experiences. I'm Kelly, and this is my co host.
Hi, I'm Debbie, and we're a mother daughter team having real conversations about real issues shared by and for Black women because we have something to say.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I know we took a little break, but we are back with another great episode. Ma, how are you feeling this evening?
I'm doing pretty good. Cannot complain. It's a lovely day now. It's beautiful.
Yes, it is. And I am so excited about our special guest today, who is one of my besties, Tanisha. Hi, Tanisha. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. Excited to be here with you, Mom. So this is great.
Yes, so happy to have you. And I am happy about our episode today. Our title is Counseling and the Black Community, which is another reason um, why I'm happy about our guest because I have known Tanisha since high school and from like I can't even remember. Ever since we met, she always wanted to major in psychology and be in the counseling field. And we would
Mhm.
use Tanisha for advice for boyfriends and anything you could think of. We're like, Tanisha, what do you think about this? And then she give us advice, and sometimes we didn't even want the advice, and she's giving it to us like, this is what you should do. I would suggest blah blah blah. But seriously, Tanisha, what made you decide to become a therapist?
So when I was about 11, I asked my mother, what is it when you want to study why people do what they do? What is that called? And she said, that's called psychology. So I went to the library because at the time I really didn't have many friends. I was new to the area. So I spent a lot of time in the library. So I went to the library and I researched what was psychology and I kind of looked at the different careers and things. So that was kind of what initially got me thinking about it. I realize now as an adult what I was really wondering was like, why was my family in such a disarray? You know, why was there so much drug and alcohol abuse? Why was there, I didn't know mental illness, like, though I didn't have the words for all of that. But that's kind of what I was trying to figure out. Like, well, why are things the way that they are?
Hmm. Wow. And so you said 11. So way before even high school, you knew what you wanted to be or what you wanted to
Yeah.
study.
Yes. Yeah. I knew what I wanted to study for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
So we know that the 2020 pandemic, there was a very traumatic times, and mental health for the Black community was definitely strained. What did you experience during this time as a Black therapist? What are some of the things that you encountered as a Black therapist?
Yeah, so I one of the things that really stood out during that time was a lot of people who reached out to me really wanted to work with an African American therapist. There was, of course, racial tension at that time, and so with my name being Tanisha, it's kind of easy to identify and say, oh, okay. So, when I would get people on the phone, they were like, we absolutely want to work with a Black therapist who's female. So that was very high in demand, not just for me, but I had other colleagues too, as well. That were like, people were saying, no, it has to be a Black therapist. And of course, one of the things that the organization that I previously worked with, we tried to do a lot of talks on like racial healing and what's some things you can do to lower your anxiety. How can we deal with stress? How can we deal with feeling like you're just powerless? So we did a few podcasts. We did an article or two, just trying to encourage people in other ways where they could, process what was going on because you felt like you were victimized or powerless with some of the racial tensions. And then also with the pandemic, it was like, what can you do about it? Everybody was at that point just staying in their house and just worried. So,
That was a traumatic time, and also what we were going through was the death of George Floyd, and so there was a lot of distrust in the Black community, and not only that, African Americans were dying at such a high rate from the pandemic, and so we all needed to talk to someone, and I figured you probably would have quite a few people coming to you as an African American therapist because of the racial tension. So thank you for sharing that, Tanisha. Thank you.
Yeah, and I could imagine it opening up like doors further of since the pandemic highlighted things, so it really opened up like just the generational trauma and things I'm sure that we as Black people have gone through as well, even through like your teachings through school. I'm sure, like, was it some things that you had to experience that wasn't taught, and like how do you differentiate like that world that was more like, okay, this is something different now, like we're being hit harder, and versus the past where I've learned like the teachings are more not really centered around African Americans. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, obviously, when I graduated from graduate school was many moons ago. So, the pandemic and just the history we've had with racism, some of those things, I think I graduated in 2004. That racism piece, like we had Rodney King when I was in college. There were a couple things like that had transpired, unfortunately. And so no, there was not a lot of teaching per se in graduate school about things like that. And then also the pandemic, we had, I think there was one, I forget what year, but many moons ago. So no one was expecting to, for it to be the way it was, because initially it was like, we only need to go in the house for 2 weeks. And then it turned out to be, many years. So, no, I don't really necessarily feel like the educate all of my education supported like specific moments in history, but I think for me, just having had this passion to want to help people, and probably for most therapists, there is that desire there that no matter what the situation, we want to rise to the occasion. Now, some want to work with kids, some want to work with people who have like experienced gun violence, like you feel your heart tugged for different issues, but I think that heart still being there, like, how can we help? What can we do to support people, and knowing that people need to process all of this, because we know the news is played over and over and over again. And that was actually one of the pieces of advice we gave, like, you can't listen to the news and social media all day long. You have to take a mental break and close your computer and turn your phone off, because you just keep saturating yourself with these same images and these same stories. It's not good for you. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It did. And when I went to college, we did have like a social work class, and we had a book that was authored by African American author. So that was a change. And our teacher talked about how in the past, the teachings didn't really put African Americans in the forefront of, and so that's what was kind of where I was going with that. Like, how did you adjust with like this pandemic, of course, that was new to all of us, but also like, how did you adjust where you probably didn't necessarily have like the teachings of that, but you talked about support and where it's mostly from the heart. So, not to put words in your mouth, but I'm thinking that was the answer.
Yeah, and also too, I do want to say I work primarily with couples, so everybody being in the house and everybody watching these events unfold, um, people started to, even in their marriage, there were questions and like, oh, we should have done with this a long time ago, or looking at the news, this brought up this issue for me. And so there was the opportunity to like stop and process more because people were at home. So
Yeah.
that was another reason why I was like, lots of calls, lots of people wanting to, and that's not all that I see, but that's primarily who I see. Yeah.
So now looking 3 years later past the pandemic, how have things changed, if at all?
I think things have calmed down some. There is less urgency. People are not feeling as scared. That piece, in terms of the pandemic, has changed some. Whereas before, it was like our phones were ringing constantly, like, oh, I want to speak to somebody, I want to speak to somebody. I think there is a more awareness of mental health issues and, like, oh, I need to do something about it. Probably we've swung more to this other route of, like, oh, using big words and psychology terms maybe inappropriately, and diagnosing ourselves. And so it's good that we're educated and we kind of know a little bit more, but now I feel like there is this, like, Google culture of, like, finding words on the internet and being like, this is what I have, you know, and calling a therapist kind of already like, well, I think I'm narcissistic. So, I'm married to a narcissistic man, that kind of thing. So, I think it's good that we are informed and we have vocabulary for some things. I don't know if that was a part of our generation of kind of knowing what it was. It was just like, oh, my uncle's strange, or there was no, like, he's schizophrenic, he's bipolar. But now everybody has the terms and they have the vocabulary, and that's good, but sometimes it's misused.
Yes.
Have you found that the people that you were seeing during the pandemic, have they kind of fallen off? Do you continue to see those same people, or have they said, "Oh, I got this now. I don't need to see her anymore"?
No, there are a few that I still see. And then I also transitioned to my own practice. So some of it I don't know, just because, um, where I was and what I've, since moved on from the other company that I was working with. But there were a couple people who followed me over.
I know that since the pandemic, like you said, like people are more aware of mental health and wanting to be seen. And do you find that, I guess, in terms of what people come to see you about, is it more across the board? I know you say you see couples and some um, individuals as well, but did you find that in the past it was more pandemic related and now it's more maybe something else related, or is it maybe a continuance of what has happened since the pandemic?
I think definitely during the pandemic, it was more pandemic related. It was like, we're in the house. We're not used to being together all this time or even being with my kids. I don't know how to homeschool and work. I have a lot of anxiety since the pandemic. I'm constantly washing down things. There was a lot of pressure to, like, figure out what's the best solution to bring your groceries in. Do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? So during those times in the early beginning of the pandemic, for sure, more people were just really afraid, and talked more about that. That sort of died down. Um, and now I think people are like, oh, I still notice I have a lot of anxiety, or I notice that I'm still very stressed, or I'm still not happy and I'm back to work.
So it's getting to the root of something more.
Yeah.
We know that the church has always been a safe space in the Black community for counseling. We, as a people, we normally do not go outside of the church for counseling. We figure our pastor is able to help us through whatever counseling that is needed. I do want to acknowledge also at this time, your husband is a pastor, and you have a huge role in your church as a confidant. Can you share how your role differs when you counsel a church member as opposed to your work as a professional therapist outside of the church?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with someone who is a member of my church, um, there is the freedom of, obviously, to just recommend scripture. Hey, also, biblical principles and spiritual disciplines. Like, have you prayed about that? Are you reading your Bible? And so there are those aspects of spiritual disciplines that you can talk more openly about. Some of the clients I see are Christian, some are not. And then even with seeing clients who are Christian, because Christianity is on a spectrum, there is that I try to give room for a client saying, "Hey, I only want a little bit of, like I don't want to pray with you, or I don't want scripture, but if I ask a specific question about something spiritual, I would want you to talk about that." And so for my clients who have identified themselves as Christians and say, "Hey, we would like to integrate this into our counseling," since that's a relationship that involves money, it is geared towards the client. So I don't have the same liberty that I would with someone who's a member of my church who may just happen to ask me a question, right? And so it's going to be a total different dynamic. I'm not approaching it as a therapist. Of course, I feel like God has wired me a certain kind of way. And so there's a gifting there, but I don't always, if Kelly was to come up to me and say, "Well, Tanisha, what do you think about such and such?" I'm not going to go and say, "Well, Kelly, tell me about your childhood. And then remember that time when you was a teenager? Could this all be coming from that?" I'm not going to do all of that with Kelly because, one, she probably would not even be receptive of it. It'd just be a waste of time because she'd be like, "No, I don't believe you." And so that's why we have boundaries as therapists where it's like, I don't work with friends and family in that way, or people in my congregation. Of course, I want to see them be whole, and all those things. But it's just approached very differently. And then if there is some really severe issues going on, I could recommend and say, "Hey, we're going to pray, we're going to believe God, but you also need to see someone, or you need to go get treatment." And so I do encourage, people to get the appropriate help if it's a situation where it's like, it's good to pray and we do believe God, but He also has put people in place to help you. Just the same way, if you had a bad foot, you would go to a doctor who can help you with that.
Great answer.
And you're right. Sometimes we do need a pill. I know we had a doctor on once before who shared that same issue. I mean, some people need medication, and it's good that we need, to be able to share that with our clients, whoever it is that you're working with. I'm sorry. And I know as a pastor of our church, even, I have to differentiate between spiritual direction and pastoring. And so that's two different things. And you're right. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Moving on to our next question. As a Black woman, Tanisha, can you describe some of the challenges that you have had as a therapist?
In regards to just in general.
Yeah, in regards to maybe clients or when exposure. I know things have changed since the pandemic, but I mean, you've been doing this for a while. So can you share any of the challenges you might have had just as a Black woman therapist?
Yeah. The only thing that comes to mind, and I would say maybe I can bring me being a Black woman into it because it's probably mindset. Like, just in terms of owning my own business, it really wasn't on the forefront of my mind to be an entrepreneur. I think I was raised in a generation that told me to go to school and that would be the answer to everything. Like, oh, go get a degree, and then all the doors will open for you. And um, obviously, that's not the case. And so there was. I don't think the generation that I was raised in, there was a lot of talk about being an entrepreneur or Black women owning businesses. I can't really recall anyone that I even knew of personally where there was like, "Oh, she's a Black woman and she owns her own business." Um, and then definitely not around like counseling or therapy. It's like maybe they owned an African store and they sold like shea butter and other African products, but no one stands out to me as like, "Oh, they did my profession." And so um but I think that was just the mindset in the family that I grew up in, where it wasn't really anything that was pushed like that. But I've over the years I've met other people who um, started right out of graduate school owning their own practices. And it was just like, wow, you know? So, but I think some of that could be the family that you grew up in and just maybe the circumstances, you know? So it's like, well, if you come from a family where there is more money and there is more talk of like, you can do this on your own, you don't need anyone else to hold your hand or work for anybody else. Some of that is just the family you grew up in, you know? And so for me just going to college was a big deal. It's like I was first generation to go to college. And so that was an achievement of in itself. And then getting my master's degree, you know, so then to now say, oh, well, I run my own practice. I just don't think it was on my mother's radar to look that far out. But she knew she wanted me to be educated though.
So her dream was just you being educated, and your dream was being educated as well, but you didn't realize how far you could come through that dream.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It was like the dream was only about the school piece
Yeah.
versus now, you know, young people have like all kinds of dreams that we would have never even thought was possible.
Right.
You know, it's like people run businesses where they like trim dogs' nails and you know, it's like or they paint them. You know, it's all kinds of things where it's just like you get paid to do that and like it's very successful. That was not um that was not the picture given to our generation. Our generation was like, you be a lawyer, a doctor. I don't even think engineering was a thing, but you know, there was like these two things, and it just seemed very far away. And it's just like, well, do your best and get your bachelor's degree. You may not be a lawyer or a doctor though. So just the conditioning, I think, of having, I don't want to say a low bar, but it was still better than like my parents just to get a degree.
Yeah, I could absolutely see that because now, like, there's being a social influencer, that can be your job. You know, like, who would have thought that? Where, as we watched, you know, Cosby, so being a lawyer and a doctor was the high bar. Like, you know, going watching Different World, going to college, a black college, that was like, wow, what? So yeah, we've come a long way in what our dreams can be and what, you know, how much we could achieve.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's probably why everybody focused on those two careers because those were the ones we saw on TV, and it was like, oh well, we got Heathcliff and Claire, they did it. But who else? You know, so
Yes, yes.
Well, I got to tell you, I am grateful, Tanisha, for your experience and your field of study because I am finding out that there are more women, black
Mhm.
women,
hmm
that are therapists and they do have their own business. And you know, you are just really making it happen. And I'm so proud of you
oh, thank
and
you.
how you have pushed forward and have done such a wonderful, you're doing a wonderful thing, not only homeschooling, you're homeschooling your kids and you have your own business. That's a lot.
Oh
And
yeah.
so I applaud you and I am so proud of you and all that you've done. There are many who can't say that. Homeschooling and to also be able to finish school and start your own business. And I know one thing that we always touch on, though, um, in this podcast, we always identify trauma. Um, and that's one thing that we need. What is that? What do we need for racial healing? And I know in your profession, there's some healing that needs to happen, and that's why they come to you in the first place.
Right.
And so there's a lot of trauma that's been passed down from generation to generation. And as a therapist, what is something that you could share with others that could possibly provide some peace and healing for our audience, for our listening audience?
Yeah. I think maybe my first piece of advice would be to re- to kind of acknowledge where the pain points are. Um, and it doesn't discredit your family to acknowledge them. like we all did the best, like I'm raising my children, I'm doing the best that I can, but there will be spaces that I don't make. There will be, my kids won't come out perfect. There will be some areas where it's like, Mom, you could have done that better, and, you go through that period of time where you're kind of like, rebellious against your parents to some extent, like, how come you didn't? But at the end of the day, as you grow and you get older, you recognize they did all they could. But with that being said, there's pain that's passed down, and you have to first recognize and say, this was painful, it's not okay. I love them, it doesn't mean I don't love them or respect them, but this has impacted me and it hurts. And I can't just sit in pride and say, well, it was okay for my family or okay for my mom, I'm going to do the same thing. It's okay to go a different route and say, you know what, this hurt me, and I'm going to go and see what I can do about it so that I can be a better person. So then, hopefully, if you have children, you set a different tone, take your kids on a different trajectory, so that your family moves forward instead of it being, well, it's always been this way, it's going to continue to be this way, and sort of taking pride in the pain. I think let's recognize the pain points, and that can be painful to even face it. Like we don't want to face some of these things. Personally, just kind of facing the fact, wow, my father didn't love me. It took me to be an adult to really say that out loud because I had so much hurt and pain around it. Like, and then to face that, it almost felt like I was weak. Like, because I had told myself, well, it didn't matter. Like his loss, but seeing my children with my husband is like, well, of course it matters if your father loves you. Of course. But it's painful to admit that. Especially with society, it's like, oh, it don't matter, girl. As long as you got that money, you got a career, you're okay.
Yes.
And it's like, no, I'm not okay. I look okay. On paper, I'm okay. But internally, there is a pain point. And me acknowledging it and wanting to do something about it is a great first step.
Amen. Amen.
Yes. I know a lot of times you say like, girl, you all right. Just, get up, keep moving.
Keep it moving,
So
right?
yeah, we just keep pushing through and pushing through. And you're right. I think it's okay to, I'm not okay, but
Yeah.
that's hard to say that, especially when you have
Yeah.
all these other things that you're dealing with. So that's a great point.
Right. But I think when Black women are dying of heart attacks more than anybody now. So maybe, I don't know all the statistics, but I've heard that a few times, and it's like we take a lot of value in being strong, and strength is good, but being strong also means that you stop and say, I need help. Because I think sometimes the strong means you don't need anybody and you don't have any reason to be vulnerable. So you stay strong in silence and suffering, and then it causes health issues, it causes breakdown in the family. You know what I mean? You're not available emotionally for the people around you because you need help. And the symptoms and signs are there, you just ignore it.
And it's passed down. I mean, people say, well, my mama had these kids and she did it. So why can't
Mm-hmm.
I do it? So it's definitely
Right.
like it's passed down from generation to generation of this strong image. and
Yeah.
and like, my grandmother did it and she had 10 kids, and stuff like that, which,
Right.
you see pride in that, but also like you don't really see the humanization in that because we think we got to be these superheroes, and we don't have to be.
Right. Or it's not talked about. You just don't. With my own family, it's just like, well, how come my grandmother didn't raise her own kids? I don't know. I still don't know. And
Mm.
so it's like, well, what was going on with her? Like what were her issues? And I've heard a couple things, but I still don't have an answer. And so there's these things where it's like you don't have enough information.
Yes.
And the people who could have given you more insight, they're deceased. So you don't have the correct full picture, and so all you may have is that, well, grandma was, like you said, she was really strong. She did all this, but then it's like, well, where were the other people? How did that all work? And so there are pieces missing from our families, and where we can't even, well, I know for myself, I can't look back 3 generations. I don't have anything to look back to because I don't have, those pieces are not there. So
Kind of sounds like an episode we did called Generational Hush.
Yes.
We talked about those things, and you're right. You can't, you just have to accept and move on. And it's okay to say that you're not okay, and that's the thing. You got to acknowledge that and get the help that you need, and that's some great advice that you've given, Tanisha. It's okay to say I need help.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess I have like one more question and then we could just close out. When it comes to therapy and healing, I know like cost is often mentioned. Have you seen things change as far as things being affordable for the communities who might can't afford these therapy sessions? How have things changed in that aspect?
Yeah. There are a few organizations. I'm not going to say a few, but I personally know of a couple organizations where they do sliding scale. There are a couple organizations where it's very low cost actually, but it's one of those things, like you have to find those resources. I personally take sliding scale for my business as well, where it's like, okay, if there's a need there, it's a fraction of the cost. So there are people out there who will work with you, say, hey, what can you afford? There are a few organizations, unfortunately, I don't know them off the top of my head, that will also give you a lower rate. And so they solicit therapists to be a part of their network to offer low cost loss counseling. So there are a few organizations out there that can help with that. And then I worked for a company where they took every insurance, even the state insurance. So there are some agencies out here that take all kinds of insurance. So I'm not saying it's not an issue, but I feel like there are more resources than ever before. And so, and part of that is the pandemic, right? Where it's just like, we know that people are still stressed and overwhelmed. And so there are a few more things now that are free or affordable. And then let me say this. Sometimes money is a barrier, for sure, right? But then sometimes you have to choose what kind of care you want. And so if you're putting your money towards clothing, a nicer kind of car, or more expensive jewelry, you have decided where where you're gonna put your funds. Now there are people who is truly like, hey, I can't afford it. Where are those resources? But then sometimes it's just choices that we make, and there's no room in the budget for this additional help that could be life changing because you prefer jewelry, or you prefer nicer shoes, or you know what I mean? So sometimes we have to just reallocate our budgets and say, you know what, for this next 6 months, I'm going to put my money towards this because I really feel like it'll be more beneficial, so that my mental health is good, or my marriage is good, or me and my kids are good. And make that sacrifice, because when we want things, I'm not an advocate of it, but people put stuff on their credit card all the time, and so I'm not promoting going into debt for counseling. All I'm saying is that when we want things at the store that maybe we can't afford at the time, we figure out a way. So if it's a case where this will be life changing for your family, figure out a way, just the same way. It's way better than material possession to have a new outlook on life and to have the support that you need.
Those are good points. Thank you, Tanisha. So I guess I don't have any more questions. Ma, do you?
No, I'm really excited about how the conversation went, and know that I totally agree with you. You can find money for other things. You can find money to get your health together, get healthy. And so I'm a proponent. I am a proponent for mental health care. So thank you so much, Tanisha. You have been amazing. We really appreciate you saying yes to
Yes.
coming on and sharing your gift with us.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course, of course. It's been a joy talking to you ladies.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and I hope you are able to take something that we said today. If you, as you go throughout your day, or share it with your family and your friends. We are now on YouTube, so if you have any comments, please leave those and hit the like button as well. And thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
True You is brought to you by Radiant Vessels and sponsored by Proviso Partners for Health. Funds for True You, a storytelling space for self-discovery, were received from the Oak Park River Forest Community Foundation.